Hello, my friends. Well, I'm not going to be honest with, or I'm not going to be honest with you. I'm not going to lie to you. I've lost patience with my internet today. And unfortunately, I think I've had the same internet provider for 19, 18 years. And I think I'm going to be getting rid of him. It's been horrible lately. So we're going to do our best. And I'm sorry I've had a busy night here. I'm just finishing up my dinner. I'm going to do my best. We're going to do our best to get through this today. We're going to really try to push and get through another chapter because we only got a couple left. And we're excited to start our new book. So, Jurgis, things were going good. He had money in the bank. And then he came across that old evil Connor, right? Connor. That was his name. And he went out. Jurgis went out drinking, came back, found a lady friend, was walking to where he sleeps every night, and he bumps into Connor, boom, 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 pummels him. He's got to use all of his money to get out of jail and get bailed out. Now he's taken off, and he's got to leave Chicago. He's got to become a tramp again, right? So, oh my goodness, excuse me. So where we had left off, he had left jail, and he had hopped onto, I think like not a subway, but a trolley car, and he was on the outskirts of Chicago. So let's pick it up from there. Poor Jurgis was now an outcast and a tramp once more. He was crippled. He was literally crippled as any wild animal which had lost its claws or been torn out with its shell. He had been shorn at one cut of all those mysterious weapons whereby he had been able to make a living easily and to escape the consequences of his actions. He could no longer command a job when he wanted it. He could no longer steal with impunity. He must take his chances with the common herd. Nay, worse, he dared not mingle with the herd. He must hide himself. For he was, for one, he was marked out for destruction. His old companions would betray him for the sake of the influence they would gain thereby, and he would be made to suffer, not merely for the offense he had committed, but for others which would be laid at his door, just as had been done by some poor devil on the occasion of that assault upon the country customer by him and Duane. And also he labored under another handicap now. He had acquired new standards of living, which were not easily to be altered. When he had been out of work before, he had been content if he could sleep in a doorway or under a truck out of the rain, and if he could get 15 cents a day for saloon lunches. But now he desired all sorts of other things and suffered because he had to do without them. He must have a drink now and then, a drink for its own sake, and apart from the food that came with it. The craving for it was strong enough to master after every consideration. He would have it, though, if it were his last nickel, and he had to starve the balance of the day in consequence. Jurgis became one more of a besieger of factory gates. But never since had he been in Chicago had he stood less chance of getting a job than just then. For one thing, there was an economic crisis. The million or two of men who had been out of work in the spring or summer and were all not yet all back by any means. Then there was the strike, with 70,000 men and women all over the country idle for a couple months, 20,000 in Chicago, and many of them now seeking work throughout the city. It did not remedy matters that in a few days the strike was given up, and about half the strikers went back to work. For everyone taken on, there was a scab who gave up and fled. The 10 or 15,000 green Negroes, foreigners, and criminals were now being turned loose to shift for themselves. Everywhere Jurgis went, he kept meeting them, and he was in an agony of fear lest some of them should know that he was wanted. He would have left Chicago only by the time he had realized his danger was almost penniless. And it would be better to go to jail than to be caught out in the country in the wintertime. So right now he's looking at this and he's going, okay, if I go to jail, I'm going to have meals, I'm going to have health care, I'm going to have a place to live. Maybe that's better than walking the country, in wintertime, which is, I think, kind of a common theme among some people today, unfortunately. I think that, we've had time in our nation's history where people have gone, you know what, send me to jail. Then I'm going to have better than I have now, so I might as well steal. I'm going to make out better either way. And I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that's the way the people think. And we have to fix that. And that's one of the reasons that Upton Sinclair has written this book. So at the end of about 10 days, Jurgis had only a few pennies left, and he had not yet found a job, not even a day's work at anything, not a chance of carrying a satchel. Once again, as he had come out of the hospital, he was bound hand and foot and facing a grisly phantom of starvation. Raw, naked terror possessed him, a maddening passion that would never leave him, and that wore him down more quickly than the actual want for food. He was going to die of hunger. The fiend reached out its scaly arms for him. It touched him. Its breath came into his face, and he would cry out for the awfulness of it. He would wake up in the night shuddering and bathed in perspiration, and start up and flee. He would walk, begging for work, until he was exhausted. He could not remain still. He would wander on, gaunt and haggard, gazing about him with relentless eyes. Everywhere he went, from one end of the vast city to the other, there were hundreds of others like him. Everywhere was the sight of plenty and the merciless hand of authority waving them away. There is one kind of prison where the man is behind bars and everything that he desires is outside. Then there is another kind where the things are behind the bars and the man is on the outside. I like that. I like that. That is a good quote, and I kind of agree with that. Note. Look at that. I can make a little note, and I can highlight that in the Kindle. You learn something new every day. There is one kind of prison where the man is behind bars, and everything that he desires is on the outside. There is another kind where the things are behind the bars, and the man is on the outside. Okay, that was deep. We just went deep. Okay, so when he was down on his last quarter, Jurgis learned that before the bake shops closed at night, they sold what they had left at half price. And after that, he would go out and get 2 loaves of stale bread for a nickel. And break them up and stuff his pockets with them, munching a bit from time to time. He would not spend a penny to save for this, and after 2 or 3 days more, he even became sparing of the bread, and would stop and peer into the ash barrels as he walked along the streets, and now and then rake out some bit of something, shake it free from dust, and count himself just so many minutes further from the end. So now he's taking things out of the garbage can. So for several days, he had been going about, ravenous all the time and growing weaker and weaker. Then one morning, he had a hideous experience that almost broke his heart. He was passing down a street lined with warehouses, and a boss offered him a job. And then after he had started to work, turned him off because he was not strong enough. And he stood by and saw another man put into his place, and then picked up his coat and walked off, doing all that he could to keep from breaking down and crying like a baby. He was lost. He was doomed. There was no hope for him. But then, with a sudden rush, his fear gave place to rage. He fell to cursing. He would come back there after dark, and he would show that scoundrel whether he was good for anything or not. He was still muttering this when suddenly, at the corner, he came upon a green grocery with a tray full of cabbages in front of it. Jurgis, after one swift glance about him, stooped it and seized the biggest of them and darted around the corner with it. There was a hue and a cry, and a score of men and boys started to chase after him. But he came to an alley and then to another branching off from it, and then leading him into another street, where he fell into a walk, and slipped the cabbage under his coat and went off unsuspected in the crowd. When he had gotten a safe distance away, he sat down and devoured half the raw cabbage, stowing the balance away in his pockets until the next day. That's tough. If you ever eat cabbage that isn't cooked, it's like, that's tough stuff to eat. It's like eating leather. Just about the time, this time, one of the Chicago newspapers, which made much of the common people, opened a free soup kitchen for the benefit of the unemployed. Some people said that they did this for the sake of the advertising it gave them, and others said that their motive was a fear lest all their readers should be starved off. But whatever reason, the soup was thick and hot. There was a bowl for every man all night long. When Jurgis heard of this from a fellow hobo, he vowed that he would have a half dozen bowls before morning. But as it proved, he was lucky to get one, for there was a line of men 2 blocks long before the stand, and there was just as long as a line when the place was finally closed up. Yikes. This depot was within danger line for Jurgis in the Levy district where he was known, but he went there all the same, for he was desperate and beginning to think that even the Bridewell as a place of refuge. So far the weather had been fair, and he had slept out every night in a vacant lot. But now there suddenly was a shadow of the advancing winter, the chill wind from the north and the driving storm of rain. That day, Jurgis bought 2 drinks for the sake of shelter, and at night he spent his last 2 pennies on a stale beer dive. This was a place kept by a Negro, who went out and drew off the old dregs of beer that lay in barrels set aside of the saloons, and after he had doctored it with chemicals to make it fizz, he sold it for 2 cents in a can. The purchase of a can including the privilege of sleeping the night through upon the floor with a mass of degraded outcast men and women. All these horrors afflicted Jurgis all the more cruelly, because he was always contrasting them with the opportunities he had lost. For instance, just now, it was election time again. With 5 or 6 weeks, the voters of the country would elect a president. And he heard the wretches with whom he associated discussing it, and saw the streets of the city decorated with placards and banners. And what words could describe the pangs of grief and despair that shot through him? For instance, there was a night during this cold spell. He had begged all day for his very life. And he had found not a soul to heed him, until toward evening he saw an old lady getting off a streetcar, helped her down with her umbrellas and bundles, and then told her his hard luck story. After answering all her suspicious questions satisfactorily, he was taken to a restaurant and saw a quarter paid down for a meal. And so he had soup and bread, boiled beef, potatoes and beans, a pie and a coffee. He came out with his skin stuffed tight as a football. And then, through the rain and darkness, far down the street, he saw red lights flaring and heard the thumping of a bass drum. And his heart gave a leap, and he made for the place on a run, knowing without asking that it meant a political meeting. The campaign had so far been characterized by what the newspaper termed apathy. For some reason, the people refused to get excited over the struggle, and it was almost impossible to get them to come to meetings or to make any noise when they did come. Those which had been held in Chicago so far had proven most dismal failures. And tonight, the speaker being no less a personage than a candidate for the vice presidency of the nation. The political managers had been trembling with anxiety, but a merciful providence had sent them a storm of cold rain. Now all it was necessary to do was to set off a few fireworks. Stella, I don't think Stella's liking the book. She's yelling at us. I'm sorry. And thump a while on. Okay, let's see. Let me back up. And now it was all necessary was to set off a few fireworks and thump a while on the drum. and all homeless wretches from a mile around would pour in and fill the hall. Then on the morrow, the newspapers would have a chance to report the tremendous ovation and to add that there had been no silk stocking audience either, proving clearly that the high tariff sentiments of the distinguished candidate were pleasing to the wage earners of the nations. So they could use these people as a kind of a little bit of a theater, right? Like it looks like these are all people that are the great, hard workers of Chicago, when in essence they started banging the drum because they knew all these poor people were going to show up so that they could get their money, when it came time for voting. So Jurgis found himself in a large hall, elaborately decorated with flags and bunting. And after the chairman had made his little speech, and the orator of the evening rose up, amid the uproar from the band, only fancy the emotions of Jurgis upon making the discovery that the personage was none other than the famous and eloquent Senator Spareshanks, who had addressed the Doyle Republican Association at the stockyards and helped to elect Mike Scully's 10-pin sitter to the Chicago Board of Aldermen. In truth, the sight of the senator almost brought the tears into Jurgis's eyes. What agony it was to him to look back upon these golden hours, when he too had a place beneath the shadow of the plum tree, when he too had been of the elect through whom the country is governed, when he had a bung in the capital campaign barrel of his own. And this was another election in which the Republicans had all the money, all but for that one hideous accident, he might have had a share of it, instead of being where he was. The eloquent senator was explaining the system of protection, an ingenious device whereby the working man permitted the manufacturer to charge him higher prices in order that he might receive higher wages. Thus, when his money was out of his pocket with one hand, cat, you're shedding like crazy, and putting it part of it back in with the other. To the senator, this unique arrangement had somehow become identified with the higher verities of the universe. It was because of that Columbia was the gem of the ocean, and all her future triumphs, her power, and her good repute among the nations depended upon the zeal and fidelity with which each citizen held upon the hands of those who were toiling to maintain it. The name of this heroic company was the Grand Old Party, the GOP. That's where that comes from today. The Republican Party, or the GOT. I guess Stella just came to shed on me. Thanks a lot. Well, I guess it could have been worse things that she came to do, though she's never done that. Okay, and here the band began to play, and Jurgis sat up with a violent start. Singular as it may seem, Jurgis was making the desperate effort to understand what the senator was saying, to comprehend the extent of American prosperity, the enormous expansionism of American commerce, and the Republic's future in the Pacific and South America, and wherever else the oppressed were groaning. The reason for it was that he wanted to keep awake. He knew that if he allowed himself to fall asleep, he would begin to snore loudly, and so he must listen. He must be interested. But he had eaten such a big dinner that he was exhausted, and the hall was so warm, and his seat was so comfortable. The senator's gaunt form began to grow dim and hazy, to tower before him and dance about, with figures of exports and imports. Once his neighbor gave him a savage poke in the ribs, and he sat up with a start, and he tried to look innocent. But then he was at it again, and men began to stare at him with annoyance and to call out in vexation. Finally, one of them called a policeman, who came and grabbed Jurgis by the collar and jerked him to his feet, bewildered and terrified. Some of the audience turned to see the commotion, but Senator Spareshanks faltered in his speech. But in a voice shouted cheery, "We're just firing a bum. Go ahead, old sport." And so the crowd roared, and the senator smiled genially and went on. And in a few seconds, poor Jurgis found himself landed out in the rain with a kick and a string of curses. Stella is over here looking at me, so annoyed. Sorry. Dogs have masters. Dogs have masters. Cats have servants. For those of you guys that have pets, my older son at a very young age said that to me. He said, "You know what, Daddy? Dogs have masters and cats have servants." And I kind of went, "Yeah, well, yeah, they really do. Cats kind of expect you to serve them and do what you want them to do. But when you want them to do something, yeah, no. Very different from a dog." So he got into the shelter of a doorway and took stock of himself. He was not hurt and he was not arrested, more than he had the right to expect. He swore at himself and at his luck for a while. Then he turned his thoughts to practical matters. He had no money and no place to sleep, and he must begin begging again. So he went out, hunching his shoulders together and shivering at the touch of the icy rain. Coming down the street toward him was a lady, well dressed and protected by an umbrella. He turned and walked beside her. "Please, ma'am," he said, "could you lend me the price of a night's lodging? I'm a poor working man." Then suddenly she stopped short by the light of the street lamp. He caught the sight of the lady's face. He knew her. It was Alina, who had been the belle of his wedding feast. Alina, who had looked so beautiful and danced with such a queenly air, with Josas Razius, the teamster. Jurgis had only seen her once or twice afterwards, for Josias had thrown her over for another girl, and Alina had gone away from Packingtown, no one knew where, and now he met her here. She was as much surprised as he was. "Jurgis Rugkiss, what in the world is the matter with you?" "I've had hard luck," he stammered. "I'm out of work and I have no money." "And you, Alina, are you married?" "No, I'm not married, but I've got a good place." They stood staring at each other for a few moments, and then finally Alina spoke again. "Jurgis," she said, "I'd help you if I could, upon my word I would. But it happens that I've come out without my purse, and I honestly haven't had a penny on me. I can do something better for you, though. I can tell you how to get help. I can tell you where Marija is." Jurgis gave a stare. "Marija," he exclaimed. "Yes," said Alina, "and she'll help you. She's got a place and she's doing well. She'd be glad to see you." It was not much more than a year since Jurgis had left Packingtown, feeling like one escaped from jail, and it had been from Marija and Elizabeta that he was escaping. But now, at the mere mention of them, his whole being cried out with joy. He wanted to see them. He wanted to go home. They would help him. They would be kind to him. In a flash, he had thought over the situation. He had a good excuse for running away, his grief and the death of his son. He also had a good excuse for not returning, the fact that he had left Packingtown. "All right," he said, "I'll go." So she gave him a number on Clark Street, adding, "There's no need to give you my address because Marija knows it." And Jurgis set out. Without further ado, he found a large brownstone house of aristocratic appearance and rang the basement bell. A young colored girl came to the door, opening it about an inch and gazing at him. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Does Marija Bursanaskas live here?" he inquired. "I don't know," said the girl. "What do you want with her?" "I want to see her," he said. "She's a relative of mine." The girl hesitated. Then she opened the door and said, "Come in." Jurgis came and stood in the hall and continued, "I'll go see. What's your name?" "Tell her it's Jurgis," he answered, and the girl went upstairs. She went back to the end in a minute or two. They ain't no such person here." Jurgis's heart went down into his boots. "I was told that she lived here," he cried, but the girl only shook her head. "The lady says they ain't no such person here." And he stood for a moment, hesitating, helpless with dismay. Then he turned to go to the door, and at the same instant, however, there came a knock upon it, and the girl went to open it. Jurgis heard the shuffling of feet and then heard her give a cry. The next moment she sprang back and past him. Her eyes were shining white with terror and bounded up the stairway, screaming at the top of her lungs. Police! Police! We're pinched! Jurgis stood for a second bewildered. Then, seeing blue-coated forms rushing upon him, he sprang after the negress. Her eyes had been the signal for a wild uproar above. The house was full of people, and she entered the hallway. He saw them rushing hither and thither, crying and screaming with alarm. There were men and women, the latter clad, for the most part, in wrappers, the former in all stages of dishevel. At one side, Jurgis caught a glimpse of a big apartment with plush-covered chairs, the tables covered with trays and glasses. There were playing cards scattered all over the floor. One of the tables had been upset, and bottles of wine were rolling about it, their contents running out upon the carpet. There was a young girl who had fainted and two men who were supporting her. There were a dozen others crowded toward the front door. Suddenly, however, there came a series of resounding blows upon it, causing the crowd to give back. At the same instant, a stout woman with painted cheeks and diamonds in her ears came running down the stairs. To the rear, quick! She led the way to the back staircase, Jurgis following. In the kitchen, she pressed a spring, and a cupboard gave away and opened, disclosing a dark passageway. Go in, she cried to the crowd, which now amounted to 20 or 30, and they began to pass through it. Scarcely had the last one disappeared, however, before there were cries from the front. Then the panic-stricken throng poured out again, exclaiming, "They're there, too! We're trapped!" You got a little cool bat cave kind of door there, right? Upstairs, cried the woman. There was another rush of the mob. Women and men cursing and screaming and fighting to be first. One flight, two, three, and then there was a ladder to the roof. One flight, two, three. Then there was a ladder to the roof, with a crowd packed at the foot of it. One man was at the top, straining and struggling to lift the trap door. It was not to be stirred, however, and when the woman shouted up to unhook it, he answered, "It's already unhooked. There's somebody sitting on it." And a moment later came a voice from downstairs. "You might as well quit, you people. We mean business this time." So the crowd subsided, and a few moments later, several policemen came up, staring here and there and leering at their victim. Of the latter, the men were, for the most part, frightened and sheepish looking. The women took it as a joke, as if they were used to it, though if they had been pale, one could not have been told, for the faint of their cheeks. One black-eyed young girl perched herself upon the top of the balustrade and began to kick with her slippered foot at the helmets of the policemen, till one of them caught her by the ankle and pulled her down. On the floor below, 4 or 5 other girls sat upon trunks in the hall, making fun of the procession which filed by them. They were noisy and hilarious and had evidently been drinking. One of them, who wore a bright red kimono, shouted and screamed in a voice that drowned out all other sounds in the hall. Jurgis took a glance at her and then gave a stare and a cry. Marija. She heard him and glanced around and then shrank back and half sprang to her feet in amazement. Jurgis, she gasped. For a second or two, they stood staring at each other. How did you come here? Marija exclaimed. I came to see you, he answered. When? Just now. But how did you know? Who told you I was here? Elena. I met her on the street. Again there was silence, while they gazed at each other and the rest of the crowd was watching them. And so Marija got up and came closer. And you, Jurgis, you live here? Oh, and you, Jurgis asked, you live here? Yes, said Marija, I live here. Then suddenly came a hail from below. Get your clothes on now, girls, and come along. You best begin or you'll be sorry. It's raining outside. Brr, shivered someone, and the women got up and entered a various door which lined all the hallways. Come on, said Marija, and took Jurgis into her room, which was a tiny place about 8 by 6. with a cot and a chair and a dressing stand and some dresses hanging behind the door. There were clothes scattered about on the floor and the hopeless confusion everywhere. Boxes of rouge, bottles of perfume mixed with hats and soiled with dishes on the dresser, a pair of slippers and a clock and a whiskey bottle on the chair. Marija had nothing on but a kimono and a pair of stockings. Yet she proceeded to dress before Jurgis, and without even taking the trouble to close the door. He had by this time divined what sort of place he was in, and he had seen a great deal of the world since he had left home, and was not easily to shook. And yet it gave him a painful start that Marija should do this. They had always been decent people at home, and it seemed to him that the memory of old times ought to have ruled her. But then he laughed at himself for a fool. What was he to be pretending decency? How long have you been living here? He asked. Nearly a year, she answered. Why did you come? I had to live, she said, and I couldn't see the children starve. He paused for a moment, watching her. You are out of work? He asked. I got sick, she replied, and after that I had no money. Then Stanislavus died. Stanislavus is dead? Yes, said Marija. I forgot. You didn't know about it. How did he die? Rats killed him, she answered. Rats killed him, gasped Jurgis. Yes, said the other. She was bending over, lacing her shoes as she spoke. He was working in an oil factory. At least he was hired by the men to get their beer. He used to carry cans on a long pole, and he'd drink a little out of each can. One day he drank too much, and he fell asleep in a corner. He got locked up in the place all night. When they found him, the rats had killed him and eaten him nearly all up. Jurgis sat frozen with horror. Marija went on lacing her shoes. There was a long silence. Suddenly a big policeman came to the door. Hurry up there, he said. As quick as I can, said Marija, and she stood up and began putting on her corsets with feverish haste. Are the rest of the people alive? Asked Jurgis. Finally. Yes, Marija said. Where are they? They live not far from here. They're all right now. They are working? Elizabeta is, said Marija, when she can. I take care of them most of the time. I'm making plenty of money now. Jurgis was silent for a moment. Do they know you live here, how you live? He asked. Elizabeta knows, answered Marija. I couldn't lie to her, and maybe the children have found out by this time. It's nothing to be ashamed of. We can't help it. And Tasmos? He asked. Does he know? Marija shrugged. How do I know? I haven't seen him for over a year. He got blood poisoning on one finger and he couldn't play the violin anymore. Then he went away. Marija was standing in front of the glass fastening her dress. Jurgis sat staring at her. He could hardly believe that she was the same woman he had known in the old days. She was so quiet, so hard. It struck fear to his heart to watch her. Then suddenly she gave him a glance. You look as though you've had some rough times yourself, she said. I have, he answered. I'll finish this page up. I haven't a cent in my pockets and nothing to do. Where have you been? All over. I've been hoboing it. Then I went back to the yards just before the strike. He paused for a moment. I asked for you, he added. I found you had gone away. No one there knew where. Perhaps you think I did a dirty trick running away as I did, Marija. No, she answered. I don't blame you. None of us ever have. Sorry. I asked for you. Oh, I found it. No, I don't blame you. None of us ever have. You did your best. The job was too much for us, she paused, and then added, we were too ignorant. That was the trouble. We didn't stand any chance. If I'd known what I would have done, we would have never won out. You have come here, said Jurgis. Yes, she answered, but that's not what I meant. I meant you. How differently you would have behaved about Ona. Jurgis was silent. He had never thought of that aspect of it. When the people are starving, the other continued, and they have anything with a price. They ought to sell it, I say. I guess you realize it now when it's too late. Ona could have taken care of all of us in the beginning. Marija spoke without emotion, as one who had come to regard things from the business point of view. I Yes, I guess so, Jurgis answered hesitatingly. He did not add that he had paid $300 and a foreman's job for the satisfaction of knocking down Phil Connor a second time. The policeman came to the door again just then. Come on now, he said, lively. All right, said Marija, reaching for her hat, which was big enough to be a drum major's and full of ostrich feathers. She went out into the hall and Jurgis followed, the policeman remaining to look under the bed and behind the door. What's going to come of this? Jurgis asked as they started down the stairs. The raid, you mean? Oh, nothing. It happens to us every now and then. The madam's having some sort of time with the police. I don't know what it is, but maybe they'll come to terms before morning. Anyhow, they won't do anything to you. They always let the men off. Maybe so, he responded, but not me. I'm afraid. I'm in for it. How do you mean? I'm wanted by the police, he said, lowering his voice. Through the course of their conversation, though the course of their conversation was in Lithuanian, they'll send me up for a year or two, I'm afraid. All right, we're going to end right there. Hell, said Marija, that's too bad. I'll see if I can't get you off. So we'll end there. We are doing pretty good. We only have a couple chapters left. We're getting so close, my friends. We're getting so close. Let me write down the page number and then we'll do the news. So what a wild day. I haven't looked outside yet. 3:57. Okay. But I know it's supposed to start snowing soon. It said by about 9:15 it was supposed to start snowing out here. I don't know if it's snowing out in the dam. But here we are. We are on May 8th. I'm sorry, I'm finishing my dinner still. May 8th, my friends, and in the past 2 months, not even, 76,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus. That's the statistic that I saw today. And however, as things in other states seem to be going upwards, here is what our governor said today. Our governor said, and I'm very sorry I'm finishing my dinner. He said, we are at this moment, New York is in control of our own destiny. So what does that mean? Well, you hear that a lot in sports. A team gets to a certain point. Some teams are not going to make the playoffs. Other teams are going to make the playoffs, and you have a team. They got 3 games left. If they win all 3 games, they're going to the playoffs. So they are in control of their own destiny.